We want to know who is here with us today. So we want to know if you're a student, a parent or guardian, a teacher, a lawyer, or a service provider. So if you want to go ahead and take a minute to respond to that, awesome. It looks like we have a variety of folks joining us today. So I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's experiences. We have some attorneys and advocates, parents, and service providers. So I think it'll be really awesome to hear everyone's perspective as we go through today. Okay. All right. So like Elise said, we're going to be doing two things today. We're going to be focusing on special education rights and disability rights and how that interplays with the school to prison pipeline. And then I'm going to do that part. And then once I'm done, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Rachael Henderson, who's going to talk about how to access and maintain disability benefits and how that involves the school. So that's the game plan for this hour together. And I do want to start out with kind of a big picture, a national sense of, you know, what we're working with here. And so I want to look at some data from the federal government, the U.S. Department of Education. And once we look at the big picture, then I want to talk about what happens on an individual level and a personal level. So the federal government, the Department of Education, tracks data, and it shows that students with disabilities are twice as likely to be disciplined than their peers who don't have disabilities. So that's true when it comes to suspensions, expulsions, being arrested at school, or being referred to law enforcement or sent to an alternative school. So we know that across the country, students with disabilities just are much more likely to be disciplined than their peers without disabilities. Okay, so what's happening on a big picture, and I want to talk about what happens on an individual, kind of personal level. So Elise, let's do our next poll, and let's find out who here has a student in special education, either their own child, someone they care for, or maybe even if they know someone in their life. Great, I'm just giving this a moment here for responses to come in. It looks like a number of us do have a child in special education. And so I would like to just open it up to our first discussion and have you all share with us, you know, what your experiences has been like with the school. Did the school ever explain to you why your student was in special education, what that meant for your student, how that might change their experience in school? So I'll just give y'all a minute to go ahead and either raise your Zoom hand or type in the chat and have Kamala share that out with us whenever y'all have a minute. Oh, great, it looks like some of us have raised our hands. Kamala, are you able to unmute anyone?
Yes, although I think that maybe from the earlier exercise when we were all sharing how much we loved Star Wars and Medea. So if you, I'm gonna go ahead and lower everyone's hands right now. If you would like to share your story, please then go ahead and raise your hand, and I will go ahead and unmute you. Okay, Taylor, I'm gonna,
Kamala, we have one yes there. So maybe
I do see that. I do see that. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute Miss Peacock, Miss Carolyn Peacock, who's gonna share.
Miss Peacock, can you hear us? Can you,
okay.
Do you wanna speak out loud?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to make a quick synopsis. I had a child who was born in 1991 with special needs, and I joined Partners in Policy Making under Governor Zell Miller, which turned a group of parents into advocates. We learned the American with Disabilities Act, public education law. From there, I opened my own child development center that was not segregated, but had 85% children with special needs, higher parents of children with special needs. The children without special needs were usually siblings. My daughter entered the school system at 3. We are a mixed race family. There was a lot of issues. There was a lot of stuff not explained. I became an advocate for other parents because of the training I went to through Zell Miller's course, learning the strategies that the school system uses to intimidate parents, to not let them know their rights. The daycare was in operation for 20 years. I have since retired and gone to work for Rachael County Juvenile Court. I am working with the children of some of the adults who went to our daycare center. Their children have special needs. We've come so far and then have not come so far. There's also a disparity based on culture, based on male versus female. I still am seeing it all the way back from the early 90s. Like I said, there are times I think we've come a long ways and then something will happen and we have not come that far.
I hear you. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It sounds like you're doing awesome work. So thank you so much for speaking up. And I think you hit on something that I see and that my colleagues and I see all the time is that parents oftentimes don't understand what's going on because the school doesn't explain these things. And some of this is really complicated. And so I think you hit on exactly something that we see. And I think there's a lot of problems, the problem for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that, there's also a trend, especially for students of color, that students of color are over-identified as needing special education services, and that may not be what they need. And so I think it's important for parents to understand and have information from the school about what the school is doing and why, so that things like racism and prejudice can be identified. And those can, we know that those are the reasons maybe not being motivated by what the student actually needs in school to succeed. So I think it's important for parents to understand this for that reason. But I also think it's a really big problem that parents don't have the answers to these questions because, like you said, Ms. Peacock, there are a lot of legal rights and protections for students in special education and students with disabilities. And so we really want parents to be aware of these things, but a lot of the times schools don't make that clear to parents. And this is really a civil rights issue. There are laws in place to protect students with disabilities from unnecessary and discriminatory punishment. And there are also laws in place to really help improve the quality of education that students with disabilities receive. So my goal here today is to talk about special education and disability rights laws and how they can be used as a tool to advocate for your student. And in turn, try to prevent that school to prison pipeline, those trends that I just had on the previous slide, prevent those statistics from being real. So I just want to also clarify that this is going to be we only have an hour, so it's going to be a really brief overview of these legal rights and protections. It could go on for hours about this. So this is a very brief overview. If anything more complicated comes up, I encourage you to consult with an attorney. Georgia Legal Services, we provide legal services for free who meet our income qualifications. And then Atlanta Legal Aid also does education work in the metro counties. So I will just go ahead and start. I'm going to go through the process kind of chronologically and what your rights are as you go through the special education process. So if you suspect that your student might have a disability or might need or would benefit from special education, you should ask the school for an evaluation. An evaluation is essentially a bunch of different assessments and tests that are done by the school to see where your student is functioning and how they're functioning. And this is normally done by a school psychologist. And I want to make sure that when you ask for an evaluation, you do this in writing. This is something I'll mention throughout the hour, but If it's not in writing, it's almost like it didn't happen. So just make sure you put your request in writing to the school district. And once they have this initial request for an evaluation, the school district has 60 days to complete that initial evaluation. And once they're done with the evaluation, they'll give you a report, a summary of the results of the evaluation. And it's going to be pretty confusing. It has a lot of like medical, psychological jargon, and it can be confusing, but I just want to emphasize that it's really important to try to understand what that evaluation means, because it's going to influence what kind of services your student gets and whether or not they're going to be eligible for special education at all. So I just want to encourage you to ask questions and try to understand what it means, even though when you get it, it just isn't going to make any sense. It takes a long time, but it's important for you to try to understand what the evaluation says. Now, once a student is in special education, once they've been put in special education, they need to be evaluated at least once every 3 years. It's called a reevaluation. And we have seen in our practice that a lot of the times this kind of slips through the cracks. Schools sometimes forget to do it, and we see students go, 5, 6 years without an evaluation. So it oftentimes falls on the parent to make sure that that happens. So remind your school district about that. And, just a reason for why that's important. It's because, students are developing and changing, and sometimes their needs are going to change from year to year. So we want to be working with accurate information about where they're functioning. I also just want to note that a student can be evaluated once a year if you need it. So if you think new information is necessary, you can ask for an evaluation once a year. Evaluations have to also consider every possible area of possible disability. So that means that if your student is having some behavioral challenges in school, or the school is calling you complaining about behavior, the school district can evaluate your student's behavior. And once they look at your student's behavior, you can develop a plan to help address that behavior and limit the chances of them being punished for that behavior in the future. So evaluation doesn't have to just be academic, it can focus on behavior as well. The last point I want to make about evaluations is that sometimes school districts get it wrong. Sometimes their evaluations just don't get the full picture and don't get accurate picture of what your student really needs. And so if you disagree with the school's evaluation, you can request that the school district pay an independent evaluator, a professional outside of the school district, to do their own evaluation. And hopefully that'll get you the information that you need to really meet your students' needs. Okay, now the next step, once you have an evaluation, is to have an eligibility meeting to see if your student is actually eligible for special education services. Now, Georgia has 13 different categories of for eligibility for special education, and each category has its own specific requirements. And the school district at this eligibility meeting should review whatever those requirements are. That should be a part of the conversation. Now, I know I just said there are 13 categories, and I'd love to go into each one with you guys, but that's just too much information. So after this meeting, we're going to send out a little summary of what those categories are, so you can be familiar with them going into this meeting. Now, I also want to say that these categories don't always require a diagnosis from a doctor. On the flip side of that, even if you have a diagnosis from a doctor, that doesn't mean that you're automatically eligible for special education. That diagnosis or that disability has to also result in a negative or an adverse impact on the student's educational performance. So eligibility does not necessarily equate to diagnosis and vice versa. The one last note I want to make about eligibility is that the eligibility category should not dictate the kinds of services that your student gets. So your student may be eligible for special education for speech and language impairment, but they also have behavioral needs. Well, the school should be addressing those behavior needs as well as providing speech services. So again, category does not determine what your student gets. Okay, now once a student is found eligible for special education, the next step is to create an individual education plan. This is called an IEP. And it's basically a document that outlines what your student's education experience is going to look like. It's like a blueprint for school for them. And this document, this IEP, should be designed to help your student or enable your student to make progress in school. And it's in the title of it, individualized, but I just really can't emphasize enough that this is an individualized process and it needs to meet the unique needs of your student. So there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all IEP. And the other thing about the IEP I want to add is that this is the document that teachers and school staff are going to be following when your student is in school. So it's important that the plan, the IEP, is detailed enough for them to know what to do with your student. So for example, if a substitute teacher comes in one day, they can pick up that IEP and know exactly what to do with your student while they're there. So we want it to be clear so that can be useful for teachers and for your student. Now, the IEP should be updated at least once a year, but it can be amended more than that if you think it's necessary. Okay, now the IEP team, or the IEP and any and all educational decisions about your student are supposed to be made by the IEP team. Now this team is required to have certain people as members, and I think the most important member is the parent or guardian. But the IEP team is also supposed to have a special education teacher, a general education teacher, and a representative from the school district. They also should have an expert or someone who can interpret the results of the evaluation that we just talked about. Now, this group, the IEP team, they're supposed to work together, and it's supposed to be a collaboration. That's what it's supposed to be. Now, Elise, if you wouldn't mind putting up the next poll, I want to see who here has been to an IEP meeting. Great. Oh, it looks like a lot of folks have. Awesome. I'm really excited to then ask you this next question. For those of you who have attended an IEP meeting, what was that like? Would you mind, raising your little Zoom hand again to share out loud what that experience was like, or typing it into the chat, and then I'll have Kamala share that with us.
Taylor, I'm going to go ahead and unmute Mr. Timothy Kemp. He actually messaged me privately that he does work with some folks who are students who have disabilities. So I'm going to unmute Mr. Kemp.
Great.
Hello, how are you?
Hi, thanks for joining us.
Yes, sorry I'm so late getting on. I am a retired educator, so I've been in many IEP meetings, and you mentioned a lot of things that I've experienced, particularly cultural differences, and I see it happening at the lower level where kids are being staffed into special education. But what is happening, the reevaluation part is very critical because, as you mentioned, kids do grow and they change. But so for some reason, the important piece of the teachers that are involved, the cultural differences and personal values tend to kick in and don't do a very good job of addressing the cultural differences. Let me give you a personal example with our own child. Our children were not special ed. Well, gifted children are under special education. She was tested, and coming from a home where it's culturally different, one question that was asked, a couple questions, she was shown a picture of a fire hydrant, but she said water hydrant. So for her, water comes out of that particular hydrant, not fire. A second one was the thermostat. At that point, our home didn't have a thermostat. We had electric heaters, but she related the thermostat to a thermometer. So those two things right there kicked her out of being into the gifted program. And I'm like, for me, that's pretty gifted if they can associate that with that particular issue. But understanding everything that you've been saying so far about the IEPs and the evaluations, for some reason, seems like behavior tends to have a big portion to do with African-American kids and IEPs. So when they're staffed into these programs when they're young, everything as they get older is the cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste. As a high school administrator, I found that a lot of these students in the program actually could learn, but they weren't being held accountable along with the parent. And I always like to make parents feel comfortable and ask questions when they come into an IEP meeting so we can adequately address the needs of the student. So I don't know, I'm just talking from experience. There's a young man that I just dealt with, and he was just expelled from school because there were some things that he did that the school system just could not tolerate and address anymore, but he's given an opportunity to still be serviced at home because he has an IEP. Mm-hmm. He's just not functional with the mainstream of the student body because we have to place them in the least restrictive environment. And all of it, he was from point A to point B. So I'm going to work with him piece by piece because I'm, as a retired administrator, I am the check and connect mentor at this school. And these are the students that I work with, highly at-risk students. And as I always say, every student is at risk for anything to happen on any given day when they leave home. So it's a lot to be said about special education. But the major important thing is cultural differences. It makes a big difference.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. You're totally right. I really appreciate hearing about your experience. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kamala, do we have anyone else who raised their hand or any comments in the chat?
I wanted to share a couple of really meaningful comments from the chat. I think a common thread that was initially shared that many people have reiterated is that advocates for the child or the parent or the child and the parent themselves are made to feel like interlopers. That is something that many people have reiterated. And also something that I think Mr. Kemp touched on, there are some IEP meetings that have been really successful. Someone shared that they've been to IEPs that have been highly individualized, and then others that are more cookie cutter, rubber stamp, same information, just copied from many student to many student, which I can say personally as someone who has done this work is certainly something that I've seen. There's a wide range of engagement in by different IEP teams, but it can be very common that as someone who's there advocating for the parent or the family, it can feel intimidating. You can feel like you are not a part of the conversation in the same way as everyone else in the room, when in fact you should be the most central person, or as at least the parent should be.
I totally agree. Yes. And actually the special education law, the federal law, recognizes how important parent participation is. So, it can feel really alienating, but you really are one of the most important members of this team. And I think you are the most important, and the law recognizes that. So one tip I want to give is if you're feeling that way, you can bring other people to IEP meetings with you. Sometimes bringing your student's counselor or their doctor, or even just a family member or someone else who can speak to your student's needs, bring people with you. And there's kind of strength in numbers, and having a more diverse perspective on your student can always help. So you don't have to go it alone. And now, just for the sake of time, I'm going to keep on moving, but thank you all so much for your comments and your thoughts. I really appreciate it. I want to talk about goals. I think this is one of the most important parts of an IEP. So every IEP should have a set of goals for the student to reach by the end of the school year. And these goals should be written to enable your student to make progress throughout that school year. Goals can be academic or functional or about behavior. So it doesn't have to be just, about reading. It can be for whatever it is that your student needs to make progress on. But one tip when writing goals is that you want to make sure that it is clear and it's measurable, because throughout the year, the school is going to be tracking how your student makes progress in those goals. So I just wanted to share an example of what a goal could look like. So the first one, student will do classwork. It's pretty vague. How do you track that? This is not an ideal goal. Now, the second option is much more specific and really allows teachers to know what it is that they're looking at and keep data on how the student is doing. So I'll just read it out loud. It says, after being directed to initiate an academic task, the student will begin working within 10 seconds, given a maximum of 1 verbal cue. And so the teacher knows exactly what they're doing. And they also know by the second sentence how much they want the student to increase or improve in that goal over the year. So right now, they're doing that about 50% of the time. But by the end of the year, we want them to be doing that 80% of the time. So this is an example of a more specific, more measurable goal that might be helpful for your student. Another part of the IEP is to look at the supports and aids that your student needs to help them reach these goals. So you might want to ask yourself, does your student need extended time on an assignment or a test? Do they need to listen to audio recordings of text rather than reading it? Do the teachers need some kind of training that will help the student? These are the kinds of aids and supports that your student could get to help them succeed in reaching these goals. At the IEP meeting, you'll also look at the different services your student could receive. And I just came up with a list here of possible services just to give you an idea of maybe what's out there and what could help your student. So they might need occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, applied behavior analysis therapy, and that's kind of like a behavior therapy, social skills, counseling even, and a co-teacher, co-teach classes where you have 2 teachers in the classroom, or a paraprofessional, like an aide in the classroom who can help your student with more individualized attention if they need it. So that's just some examples that I wanted to put out there in case this is all new to you. Okay, now I want to talk about behavior again, the behavior intervention plan. So if your student is having trouble with behavior or you're getting calls from the school about behavior or discipline, an IEP can include a plan to address your student's behaviors. So like I said, this is a behavior intervention plan, and it should include a number of things. The first thing you want it to include is a definition or description of the specific behavior that you're looking at. Maybe it's making impulsive statements to peers or, saying something to peers. The next thing you want the behavior intervention plan to have is a hypothesis of why that behavior is happening or what is motivating that behavior. So maybe it is seeking attention, or maybe it's trying to escape some kind of work task. Then you want to look at what the school can do about it. So you want to look at positive behavior supports to help that student kind of prevent that behavior. So think about skills you can teach the student to do instead of that behavior. And the last part that's important for this behavior intervention plan is a description of what the school should do in response to when your student does show that behavior. So maybe it's letting the student sit silently for a minute by themselves or take a walk. What is the school going to do in response? And so the goal is in this plan is to have the school follow this behavior intervention plan, which will then help your student manage their behaviors and also reduce chances of discipline. And so at the very beginning of this hour, I talked about evaluations and how the school can evaluate a student's behavior. This behavior intervention plan should be informed by that evaluation, those evaluation results. It'll be really helpful in understanding what's going to be useful to helping your child manage the behavior. Okay, the last big section of an IEP, or what an IEP team is going to talk about, is placement. And we heard earlier the least restrictive environment, well, that comes up with placement. So there are different options for a student with disabilities or a student in special education. And the continuum goes from least restrictive to most restrictive. And so you go across the screen and you can see the least restrictive environment is a general education classroom where students are educated with all their peers. A more restrictive setting is a special education classroom, and your student may be there for just one class or maybe for the whole day. And then an even more restrictive placement would be a separate school. And Georgia actually has a separate school specifically for students with emotional and behavioral challenges. So that's just an example of what a separate school would be in the state of Georgia. And then the most restrictive also that we heard about earlier is hospital or homebound, or even residential setting, and being educated in those settings. That is the most restrictive setting. And the law says that to the maximum extent possible, students with disabilities should be educated with students who don't have disabilities, with their peers who aren't in special education. And this is because we have a really long history in this country of segregating people with disabilities and students with disabilities from their peers, from their communities, from their friends and family. And so because of this history, we want to make sure that moving a student from their peers is kind of a last resort. So basically, the school's job is to provide supports and services to enable your student to succeed in the least restrictive setting possible. And only when it's clear that your student needs more intensive services should the IEP team talk about moving your student to a more restrictive setting. Okay, now discipline. Now talking about the school to prison pipeline. Students with disabilities have certain legal protections in the school discipline process. And this is to ensure that students aren't discriminated against because of their disability. And these protections kick in if a student is facing suspension or expulsion for more than 10 school days. So if your student is being suspended for 7 school days, they can be disciplined like any other student. But if the school is trying to suspend them for more than 10 school days, the IEP team has to have a meeting. They have to get together and look at the relationship between the alleged misconduct or the alleged misbehavior and that student's disability. And that's because a student legally cannot be disciplined for more than 10 school days if that conduct is related to their disability. And so the IEP team is supposed to get together and to have this discussion about the connection between disability and the behavior. And if the IEP team decides that it is connected to the disability, then no punishment can occur. And also, the IEP team will order that a new behavior assessment be done. So we can update that behavior intervention plan so that it's more effective. Now, if the IEP team decides that the alleged conduct or misbehavior is not connected to the disability, then the school can punish the student like any other student without a disability. So I want you to keep that in mind. And, this is an IEP meeting. So like I said before, you can bring people with you to these meetings. And I have found that having a doctor or a counselor or a therapist who can come and explain to the team what the student's disability looks like and how it manifests can be super important in preventing unnecessary punishments. And even if you can't get them to come with you, maybe ask them to write a note explaining the student's disability so the IEP team is the most informed it can be when asking this question or considering this question. The other thing that the IEP team should consider at this kind of discipline meeting is whether or not the school followed that behavior intervention plan we just talked about. So the school has to follow that behavior intervention plan as it's written. And if the school does not follow it, then the student cannot be punished for the school's failure to follow the plan. Now, I'll warn you, it's pretty uncommon for a school district to admit that they didn't follow the plan, but that is what the law says. And so if you see this, know that even if you lose this meeting, your student is punished, you can appeal that decision, and I suggest you talk to an attorney about that. Okay, and we're in the middle of COVID. We have students learning in all different environments right now. So I wanted to briefly talk about distance learning and what that looks like for students with IEPs. So I just want to be really clear that you and your student have exactly the same rights you had before the pandemic. So nothing has legally changed because some students are learning at home right now. So what that means is that the school still has to follow the student's IEP. Some districts are creating new documents called distance learning plans, and they're a part of the IEP, and what they're supposed to do is outline how the IEP is going to be implemented while the student is learning from home. But again, the IEP is still in place and should still be followed. And most things in an IEP can be done from a distance, can be implemented from a distance. You can give your student extended time on assignments. You can have one-on-one sessions with a teacher through video chat. But there are some things that are not possible. And so I just want you to be aware of that. But if there are things that your school district is not doing right now while your student is home, it may mean that the school is going to owe you services in the future when they are able to provide that and it's safe to be back face-to-face. So we could talk about this for hours and hours, but I just want to leave you with 2 points that I think are helpful for managing this time right now. One is try to keep track of the services your school is and is not providing, because like I just said, school may owe your student services in the future. So knowing what is falling through the cracks now is going to help you make the case to the school later that they owe your student services. The second point I want to make is that I really encourage you to let your school know when your student is struggling. So that means you can request an IEP meeting like you would normally do, and you should do it through a computer, do it virtually like we're doing today. And letting the school know what your student is struggling with puts the school on notice that they need to change things. They need to try something different. Parents cannot be expected to figure this all out on their own. And the school, they're professionals. And it's their job to make sure that your student continues to learn and be educated at this time. So let the school know. Don't hesitate to ask for that IEP meeting if your student needs the help. Okay, my last slide I want to talk about is just some reminders of the things that we mentioned throughout this last 40 minutes. The biggest thing is that you and your student have rights. Like we said at the very beginning, a lot of folks don't even know that they have rights when it comes to special education and disability rights, but you do. Another tip is make sure you put it in writing. Like I said, if it's not in writing, it's almost like it didn't happen. And you are an essential member of the IEP team. As a parent or guardian, you are essential even if it doesn't feel like that, because you know your child best. I also want to remind you that you don't have to go it alone. You can invite friends, experts, an attorney to come with you. There's strength in numbers. And my last point is that you can disagree with the school. They don't always get it right. And if they don't get it right, you can seek legal help. And there are some steps that can be taken to kind of resolve those issues and improve the situation for your student. So those are just some reminders I want to leave you with. I think I have a couple of minutes, 2 very short minutes, where I want to see if we have any questions or comments before I hand it over to Rachel to talk about benefits. Kamala, do you have anything? Or Eugene, do you have anything?
I was trying to answer the questions the best I could while we're going through. If I missed it, feel free to go ahead and re-chat it. They're mostly comments. I'll let Kamala talk about that. Some really insightful comments.
Yeah, we've had some really incredible comments. I'm so grateful to everyone for their engagement and thoughtful contributions. I kept wanting to interrupt you, Taylor, and read out some of these great comments. I want to read a comment from Paula Rafferty, which I absolutely echo, asking for compensatory education for the period of time that students have been virtual learning if they're not getting what they need, or if the school is not complying with their IEP. You said all of this already, Taylor, but keeping track of what the student is getting, letting the school know in writing that the child is or isn't struggling. If your school is particularly good about providing you with what in IEP lingo is called, oh my gosh, I'm spacing, but like performance data, how to measure if your student is making progress monitoring data, thank you. If keeping that, getting your hands on that, because even if your student can't receive certain therapies now, that doesn't mean that they can't get it on the back end. Let me take a look. There are a couple.
Sorry, Kamala. There was one question that just came up, Taylor, and that is, how quickly can a child be reevaluated? And someone did answer it. That is 1 year. I think you went over this. If your child has an IEP, you are entitled to one evaluation by the school per year. And this question might actually be related to, well, what if your child was evaluated and the team determined that the child was ineligible? How quickly can you get another evaluation done? And in that situation, you can actually ask for an independent educational evaluation after the schools if you disagree with it. Also, there is no, if the situation has changed, new diagnoses, new events, child fine laws under IDEA do not say you only get one shot at this every X number of years. It is the obligation of the school to find children who may have disabilities and evaluate them. So I hope that answers that question.
I want to hear, it sounds like there are a lot of really great comments, but I want to make sure that Rachael has time. She has also a ton of really great information. So I want to make sure that Rachael has time. But maybe at the end, we can continue this discussion if there is more time. So Rachael, on to you.
Thank you. I find all of those comments really insightful. I've been working with school children and supplemental security income and disability for a long time. And one of the things we are concerned about, first of all, and I want to tell you, most of the information I'm providing today are in PDFs. So when this is uploaded, you can pull off the little nugget that you want that responds to your question, hopefully. First of all, I did a session for parents a couple of years ago. People were unaware of the fact of something called the Supplemental Security Income Program. That's SSI. And kids are eligible for SSI. And I encourage parents to apply because consistently throughout this presentation, we spoke about disability. Technically, SSI is a program where you apply and you allege a disability. You can, I know there are rather severe and difficult income issues in terms of eligibility, but it's a two-pronged program. So you might get a decision regarding your disability, but the family not be ineligible in terms of income, but at least you have that disability decision. Those disability, and she's going to pull up SSI in a minute, and it's found on www.ssa.gov is a good summary of the benefits that are available for children. And not only will a child have mental impairments, they can have motor or physical impairments too. And how does this dovetail into what we talked about today? Frequently, this will dovetail into someone who has an impairment that's physical, can impair or impede educational achievement. And we see a lot of cognitive kind of decisions, but we use all of the tools that Taylor just made reference to, including teachers' questionnaires, the IEP, friends, neighbors, everybody, in terms of providing information to Social Security as an agency that will help the child demonstrate that the child is disabled under the program. And once we get that, then that will influence also whether or not and what kind of services you get, because then you have a definitive definition of disability. And disability can include learning disabilities, dyslexias, and frequently, and I responded to Eugene just a moment ago, and some of you talking about how frequently to reevaluate. As you get new information, sometimes you will have an IEP based on the fact that the child has ADHD. In a lot of the cases that I'm involved in, I say, wait a minute, that's not even the right diagnosis. You know, where did you come up with that diagnosis? Mom is saying the child has fetal alcohol syndrome, and that's an entirely different scenario. So we went back in less than a year, looked at it in terms of fetal alcohol syndrome, used all the medical records, used all the psychologicals, and worked through that whole process. And the entire IEP changed to reflect a more accurate and definitive definition. And by that time, the child was indeed receiving SSI because his pediatrician confirmed the diagnosis of fetal alcohol syndrome as opposed to another disorder. Similarly with major depressive disorder in children. Now, in order to be advocates with that disability decision, you can then go to the local, your school system and say, I have a disability decision, let's talk about services. How do we deal with the hyperactivity? And as Taylor said, use a physical therapist, and she developed a system and an occupational therapist from an active fetal alcohol syndrome child to use colorful gym clips. That dealt with behavior. It's a fluid situation. You have to, as a parent, stay on top of it. And I know it requires a lot of activity, but you have to work. It should be a system where you work together, and the parents need to encourage their children, but to also encourage the teachers to listen to them, especially instead of putting them in all special education classes, because Social Security will look at how that child functions in comparison to other children. Now, there is another slide. Now, that slide that you're probably looking at goes through all the requirements for SSI, what the problem is if you have income, but most importantly, we want to look at what happens with a child when they apply for benefits. Now, for older children, here's the standard for disability. Now, let me tell you what's going to be interesting. When you look at the school system's reports that are developed by the school psychologists now, they're going to reflect all of this. If you look at the IEP, if you look at also the teachers' questionnaires that they have to complete, you're going to see the same language that SSI has developed for disability, the same language: presentation, response, setting, timing, scheduling. You're going to look at that, whether they meet a listing, how they acquire, how they use information. All of that is now pretty much similar across the board and consistent. So you're going to see this in your SSI application. You'll see it in terms of the psychologist report, because all the mental health requirements were changed. So if you look at the new DSM-5, all of this is consistent. So school teachers talk to me all the time, how do I make sure this is set up properly? So you will see the same language. Now, the next slide that I have, I think, and I'm going through really quickly so we can have a discussion period, but you can look through all of that and look at the same thing. Now, Eugene mentioned a minute ago the IDEA for individuals with disability education. Now, this is an act that is really, really helpful, especially when you talk about transitional plans and IEP. Once you get to a child who is, say, age 16 with the IEP, and you also need, this plan should change. What are your vocational goals? But I see children being disciplined and say, well, at 19, you can no longer stay at the school. That's not true. The IDEA said that child is entitled to free and appropriate public education until the child is age 22. So they can stay in the local high school. They can stay in the local high school. They can't tell them they aged out. And it requires the school to prepare the student for life after high school. And see, that's that individual educational plan transition. So all of these programs work together. So services include vocational education, supportive employment. Now, most of you probably online have seen a lot of kids put in CNA classes, nursing assistance classes, orderly classes at the hospital. Those are some of the services, but they can be higher functioning than that even. So we need to look at all the services provided. Social Security will look at all the services provided and then make a decision. But most importantly, if you have an SSI recipient child, Social Security under the IDEA, the fancy term sometimes is Section 301, cannot terminate that child's benefits because they actually have an IEP and they are engaging in vocational education. So they cannot terminate it. And that's very important that you know, because we see a lot of those cases, and Georgia Legal Services has helped a ton of cases over the last couple of years. Now the next page, some of the kids can work and they can earn up to a certain amount. And so some of our school systems already have kids working part-time in a supportive work program. That plan can be incorporated into their IEP. There's a work subsidy, and I provide the 2020 monthly income limit amounts for all those kids. So please remember, all of these play together, the IEP, eligibility for SSI, and that gives the parent not only income, which is $783 a month, but it also gives them access to Medicaid. So as Taylor was saying, you might need supplemental tests, and you can go to the psychologist of your choice, the psychiatrist of your choice, the internal medicine, the pediatrician, and you can supplement what that school system has on your own. And that will be extremely helpful. One of the things too that's very important, somebody talked about it and Taylor did, is that when you go to all of these additional and get this additional information, make sure as a parent you are in the room, because they need to build a legitimate history so they can say, well, we need this service, and that doctor can say, you do need this service. And then Social Security will say, oh, there are a panoply of service, there's a holistic approach, child continues to be disabled, benefits continue. So the next one is, okay, the Section 504 accommodations. Now, IDEA is heavily people-oriented. Everybody has to play their role, and you have to encourage them. This is more when you talk about accommodations in Section 504 of the Rehab Act. And let me tell you what's so interesting in the IEP is there would just be a little paragraph in there. This is a Section 504 child, but it doesn't tell you what the consequences of that determination is. And as Taylor indicated earlier, it might not even be people. As I said, it was multicolored gym clips. It could be sitting closer to the bulletin board. It could be working on computers in the classroom while another group is working on something else. These are adjustments, longer periods for taking tests and exams so they can function better. All of that is under Section 504. And I provide this language because parents, as we indicated, are frequently intimidated by the school system. Now you can walk in and you can pull out this sheet and say, this is 504. You can pull out this sheet and say, this is IDEA. Let's go to the next section, please. There are two compared, and I talked about this. One is accommodations and modifications. And modifications can be across the board. If a child is diabetic, for example, and taking medication, sometimes steroids, they come to school in the morning, they are very hyper. They have that fight or flight. They have to calm down during the day. You have to talk about when medications are given. Those are modifications that help that child function based in their classroom. So I compare the two, and the next slide, please. And you can pull this off. Then I talk about resources. You earn income tax credit to get additional funds into the house to help you pay for that child support, the child tax credit. It's a great little chart that goes through everything you need to say. I know I'm speaking quickly, but I'm trying to make sure I do it within this 10 minutes. To request, okay, go to the next part of that slide. keep going. Adoption assistance, we got a lot of grandparents raising grandchildren. That's who's there in the schoolroom now. They can play for benefits. They retire to disabled. I talk about foster care, TANF. There are a ton of programs out there. You get additional income, but most importantly, you get Medicaid. And with Medicaid comes transportation to parents who might have transportation problems. Okay, and this stop talks about how they cannot terminate benefits and what Section 504. And then next slide. Also, there are a couple of advocacy groups in Georgia. I don't know how many people are aware of Parent to Parent of Georgia. I provide all the, this is a parent-based advocacy group. They are primarily in Atlanta, but I understand they have some satellite offices throughout. And I've actually used them. They have kids from ages birth to 26. I've called them and said, we can't handle all of these cases. And they'll send a parent down and they will be good advocates, okay? Now let's look at the next one. Okay, the next slide. Hold on, I gotta get something out of the way here. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about briefly is that under this pandemic, you got some EBT special funds, some of the kids. How many of us realize for generations, kids have to be healthy, and one of the things that can impact a child's ability to perform, and SSI looks at that, is whether or not they have a good, solid source of food. So one of them is the new food stamp programs, the Women and Infant Children's Program, and disaster household food distribution, because food directly impacts how that child performs in school and on tests. Also, Taylor and Eugene and Kamala also suggested migrant children are entitled to certain support in school. Don't forget that the Migrant Education Program is a federally funded program. It supports comprehensive educational programs. And I know particularly in Ware County, we have an advocate. She is excellent in terms of connecting those benefits. And the McKinney Dental Homeless Assistance Act, one of the things that teachers frequently complain about, and even Social Security trying to find out where children are, is how frequently people have to move because of income shifts and other things in their household. You can stay in your jurisdiction with your functioning IEP. And it's extremely important that you realize that. And SSI and all the other entities need to work together. Thank you. I think I did it in 10 minutes. There are a ton of resources out there, and I hope some of this was useful.
Yes, it was. It was extremely useful. Thank you, guys. We're awesome. I am clapping. Yeah. And we will provide you all a video as well as a handout, a detailed handout, very detailed handout for you. And we will also send you a survey, because if you want our education team to do something more specific, want to spend more time, this was a good overview, our two-part overview, then you'll be able to provide that information on that in that survey. So we appreciate you coming. We thank you. Did you have any questions or anything you want to ask? I know it's 5:01, but if there's a question that you might have for Miss Rachael, please, if you see anything, Eugene or Kamala, then we'll take that question, and otherwise we'll just head on out, knowing that the video is coming, the handout is coming, and a survey. Thank you, guys. Anything? No? Okay. Well, Miss Rachael, you did it. Kamala, Taylor, Eugene, yay!
Thank you, Elise.